So today we're going to talk about planting for problem areas. The goals are to better understand what these problem areas are. I think it's important to know why things aren't growing well in a certain area or why we consider it a problem area. And that makes it easier for selecting the plants. A good idea for any problem area is to put plants with low maintenance, and I tend to do that in all over the garden, but particularly where we have a problem, we want to go low maintenance, and we'll talk about that. And then we're going to select a whole bunch of plants that we can use. So let's first look at what low maintenance is. Here's my definition. It looks good all year. There's no fertilizing required. In fact, in my garden where I grow about 3,000 different plants, I don't really fertilize anything except containers and vegetable gardens. So none of my ornamental gardens get fertilized at all. We want minimum annual cleanup, no watering, no weeding. It's nice to have some flowers so we get a little more color. No deadheading, so we want those flowers to bloom and then take care of themselves, so we don't have to go around cleaning that up. And ideally, we want plants that don't need to be divided for at least 10 years. And if we can find plants that fit this category, then we got a pretty low maintenance garden. Here's some of my favorite low maintenance plants. And these aren't necessarily for problem areas. These can be used all over the place. But I find these really easy to grow. One of my favorite is Geranium sanguineum. It's a hardy geranium. It's a low-growing plant, so it's only about 6 to 8 inches tall. Flowers most of the summer. The flowers just kind of shrivel up and disappear. You don't have any ugly seed heads, so you don't have to clean the flowers out after they flower. It's thick enough so that weeds never grow underneath this, and it doesn't spread very fast, so it moves a few inches every year. I would say probably every 5 years I just cut it back so it doesn't get too big. And that's it. I don't do anything with this plant. It comes in pink, white, and there's a white striped one. It does self-seed a little bit, but if you're mulching your gardens, you won't find very many seedlings at all. So this is one of my ideal plants. Nepeta Walker's Low is also good. Really, any of the Nepetas are great plants. Walker's Low just seems to be a plant that flowers a little more and maybe is a little more drought tolerant. These plants never need to be watered once they're established. They flower really nicely. They slowly spread. Quite honestly, I don't do anything with this plant. In the fall, I just leave it. By spring, the flower heads are laying on the ground, so I don't even clean it up in spring. Now, I know in a garden where you want it kept a little neater, you'd have to do a little cleanup in the fall or the spring. Here's a plant that very few people really grow. Stachy's Helen von Stein, or the big ears Stachy. The lamb's ears that everybody grows is really popular, and I see it in every perennial book, and I think it's just a horrible plant. It doesn't flower very nicely. It seeds around a lot. The seedlings that it does make are hard to pull out because they have quite a big root system, and it's just an ugly plant. I don't know why it's so popular. And yet there's this one here, the big ears. It's not quite as fuzzy, but it makes a nice low ground cover. It's very thick once it's established, so there's no weeding here. This one doesn't flower, so that's a downside to it, but because it doesn't flower, we also don't get a lot of seedlings. What I find with this is if you have a big clump, you will get 1 or 2 flowers a year, and that's it. But it's generally non-flowering. It's a great ground cover. Here's another plant. There's really zero maintenance. Festuca glauca. Great plant. In zone 5, it's evergreen. So all winter long, it's got this green coloration. By spring, some of the leaves have died back and are brown. You can just leave that and the wind will just blow them out of there. Or if you want it to look a little nice, use your fingers as a rake and kind of rake out the old stuff in the spring. It's good for another year. Other plants that I'm a big fan of are evergreens. They're not quite as interesting, but they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and colors. You can pick an evergreen for a particular spot. You can decide how fast it's going to grow. So you can go and find an evergreen that will grow 1 inch a year, another one that's 3 inches a year or 5, 6 inches a year. And if you select it that way, then it will stay in the spot you put it in and fit there for a long time. In fact, my smallest evergreen grows something like a 1/4 inch a year. Plant I have right now is maybe a foot tall, and in 20 years from now, it might even reach 2 feet tall. The nice thing about evergreens is you can select them for the space that you have. But you do have to be careful when you're selecting these. So this is an absolutely beautiful plant, Chamaecyparis obtusa. It's a nice green color, it's a nice shape to it. It has this light green outer foliage. The problem with this plant is that in zone 5, it's not quite tolerant of our cold temperatures. The plant itself is hardy, the root is hardy, but the outer leaves get damaged. It's a combination, I think, of the cold and the wind. They dry out. So by spring, you've got several of these branches that are brown and they have to be trimmed back and cleaned up. If the plant is not established, then it might even die in its first year. Once it's established, it's quite hardy in zone 5. Great looking plant, but it's not my first pick for a garden because it takes more maintenance than others. I mean, you can pick this one here, which is also Chamaecyparis. This one is Piscifera. And it's completely hardy in zone 5. It comes in green forms, also comes in a nice light yellow form. It just grows, and you can trim it back if you want to keep it a little smaller, but you don't have to. It just takes care of itself, makes these kind of unusual roundish clumps, and you just leave it alone. Zero maintenance. One of the plants that attracts a lot of attention when I have an open house is this one here, and it's not grown a lot. It's called the fleece flower, Persicaria polymorpha. This is a true perennial. So in the spring, it's underground. You don't see anything there. It slowly comes up, and you think, well, geez, it's not going to do much. And then suddenly it has this growth spurt. And within 3 or 4 weeks, it's up to 5 feet tall, makes these white plumes of flowers, which are really great. And the flowers have nice colored bracts, so they actually look as if they're in flower for 6 weeks to 2 months. It's a great plant. The problem is it's a large plant, right? This is 5 feet, 6 feet tall by 5 feet wide. And when people see it in the garden, they all go, oh, my garden's too small for a plant that big. But I think one important thing people have to do with a small garden is put in a few larger plants. That's what makes the garden. And what most people do is they put small plants in a small garden, and then nothing ever looks particularly special. You need that 1 or 2 really special plants that's a good size to kind of make the other plants look more special. So let's have a look at some of these problem areas. And probably the most common one is the shade. The north side of my house is complete shade, faces north, but in fact it's really not complete shade. So in this picture, it's very early in the morning. It's in full sun. And by about 5, 6 at night, it's in full sun again. During the rest of the day, it is in full shade. So many of the spots in our gardens are not really full shade. They do get shade at some part of the day. They're just a very shady part of the spot. Here's another picture of the hill in my garden, and I took this one on purpose. On the left there, you see a nice sugar maple, and it's a huge tree. It's about 200 years old. In front of you, you see a very shady garden, but in fact, that's a full sun garden. I just happened to take the picture right at noon when the trees to the right of the camera position are casting some shade on this garden. So you do have to go to the garden and visit it several times a day and find out where the shadows really are and how much shadow you have. If you only came and looked at this garden or you looked at pictures, you might conclude, well, this is a nice shade garden, but in fact, it's a full sun garden. Growing under maples are a real problem. The problem is twofold. We have the shade from the plant, but we have a second problem, which is probably worse, and that is that the soil is really dry. So maples have roots that are very fibrous. They suck up a lot of moisture, so the soil underneath them is very dry. So now we have this dry, shady area. This is an interesting plant. It's a Japanese anemone called Pamina. This is a very invasive plant. It spreads like crazy. But I found that this particular variety doesn't spread as much as others. And if you put these Japanese anemones in shady areas, they don't spread nearly as fast as if you put them in sunny areas. So this is a plant I do have underneath some trees. It gets a fair amount of shade. It does spread a little more than I'd like, but it's not too bad. It's a lower growing one. So this one is going to grow up to about 2.5 feet tall. Has these nice pink semi-double flowers. When we think about trees and their roots, a lot of people visualize this kind of a picture. So a tree that's very round and globe-shaped has a round globe-shaped roots underneath it. And the roots kind of mimic the shape of what's above. If we're talking about oak trees, like the one on the right, the trees are more vertical and the root system is more vertical. We also talk about trees having different kind of root systems, right? We have some that are fibrous root systems, and then we have some that have tap roots. And again, this oak is notorious for having a tap root. And I see a lot of advice online that says, well, if you're going to plant a tree, plant one with a taproot because the root goes deep instead of sideways. And that means that you can plant other things around that tree and you'll have less competition with the tree roots. In fact, everything I've just described about these trees is really wrong. All tree roots look more like this. We have a tree and the root system is much, much wider than the top part of the tree. And this is true even for things like oaks that have big taproots. So trees with a taproot, they do start growing a big taproot as seedlings. So the first couple years, it's as if they have like one root that goes straight down. But as that tree matures, it grows more and more side roots. And over time, it abandons that deep taproot. It can still be there. It's used for support, but it's not a functional root. So even trees that have tap roots end up with most of their roots right at the surface of the soil. And so all these trees are going to give us problems underneath. So how do we solve shade problem? One solution that people come up with is they put more soil on the ground. They've dug in the soil, they find all these roots, and they figure, well, I'm going to go up. I'm going to get some fresh soil, put it on top, put 6 inches to a foot of soil on there, and then I'll plant in that. And that works for a little while, but it doesn't work for very long. It doesn't take long before the tree roots find this good soil and grow into it, and then you have the same problem you had before. The same thing is true with raised beds. People will build raised beds under trees, fill the beds with soil. Sometimes they put weed barrier at the bottom to try and slow down the roots. But roots will grow wherever they find what they need, and that's moisture and nutrients and oxygen. Those are the 3 things plant roots need. And so it doesn't take long before they start growing into that soil. Even if you have weed barrier at the bottom, they'll find a way in, and eventually they fill the whole raised bed with roots. And then you're back to having the same problem again. Now, using containers in a situation like that does work because you can easily move them from time to time and the roots are less likely to grow into the pot. Another thing you can do is limb them up. And this is probably the best solution. If you take the lower branches off so that you could walk underneath the tree, you'll suddenly find that it's not nearly as shady under that tree. And now you can plant all kinds of things underneath it. The downside to that is that you've created a larger garden, which of course requires more maintenance, and the tree doesn't keep its natural look. So we've made this artificial tree that has a big trunk at the bottom, goes up to the lower limbs, and then the lower limbs come out. Another trick you can do when you're planting these areas, particularly when there's a lot of tree roots, is to plant smaller plants. Now, what I mean by that is smaller transplants. Not that the plant will necessarily be small when it matures. So it could be a very large hosta, but rather than planting a big hosta where you have to dig a big hole and do a lot of root damage, we dig small holes and plant very small hostas and let them grow into bigger plants. Let them compete with the roots that are already there. This is an Ontario native that I think people should be growing a lot more. It's Tiarella cordifolia. It loves shady conditions. It can grow quite well in the clay type soil we have in Guelph. It's a short plant. It's only like 2 inches tall, has this nice flower in late spring. It's a great plant. The one problem with it is that it does like to spread, and that's both a plus and a minus in this case. So it likes to spread, so it will cover a larger area. But because it's only 2 inches tall, it won't grow well under other things. So if you take a bed that has, say, hostas in it that are 2, 3, 4 feet tall and plant this at the base of the hosta, this plant will go into spaces where it's getting enough light, but it won't fill the whole garden because it's too shady under those larger plants. And so it kind of fills in the spaces around the larger plants. The other nice thing about this is because it flowers so early, it's flowering when the hostas are still just starting to grow, and you've got some real nice interest in the garden. Another great plant is Astrantia. And they come in different colors, so some are deep reds, there's lots of whites, pinks, different shades in between. It's a very long-lasting flower, very tough plant, can take high shade, can take high drought. This plant, once it's established, really doesn't need any care at all. You can come along in the spring and just kind of cut it down and clean it up a bit if you'd like, or it will do that on its own. It has a dry parts of the plant just fall to the ground and you just leave it. But the Astrantias are great. I keep saying, you don't have to water these plants. All of these plants really need watering the first year when they're being established. And that's true of regular plants and drought-tolerant plants. They all need some care until they get established. It's also very important not to water these guys too often. You don't want a sprinkler system here that's coming on every 3 days to keep these guys well watered. What we want to do is we want to water when they need it. We want to water very deep and infrequently. And once it has deep roots that are established, then it's really drought tolerant. And that's true of all the drought tolerant plants. A plant that's very popular is Pachysandra. Unfortunately, the one we're growing is actually an Asian variety and is fairly invasive. Now, it's great, and people grow it because a nice ground cover. It just covers everything, and that's a plus. The problem with it is it's escaping into wild areas, and so there's lots of wooded areas in Ontario now that have big fields of Pachysandra, and they basically eliminate all of our native plants. We could be planting this one instead. This is a North American native, and it's not quite as aggressive. It does form a nice ground cover, very drought tolerant, grows great in shade, and it has nice little flowers. But it's not as competitive as the Asian species, so we should be moving over to this one and use this one more. One of my favorite plants is Solomon seal. This is the standard one. It's got these great little bells for flowers. Close-up picture. This is a tough plant. I grow it in almost full sun. I grow it in very heavy shade. It never gets watered. It grows under sugar maple trees, and it just seems to do well in all those spots. Part of the secret to its longevity is that it actually has little tubers underground, and those hold a lot of moisture, so it can go through a dry period, but it's just a great plant. Now, there is a version of Solomon seal that's only about 8 inches tall. That one makes a really nice ground cover as well. Flowers aren't quite as interesting as this one, but it's nice and low, spreads really nicely, and makes a great ground cover. Ferns can be used quite nicely in dry shade areas, but with ferns you have to be very careful. And I take ferns and I sort of clump them into 4 kind of categories, so you really have to be careful which fern you purchase. There are ferns that like it to be very sunny, and there's ferns that like shade. There's ferns that like it very dry, and there's other ferns that like it very wet. And you have to know which condition your plant needs. If you put it in the right condition, then it does really well. This species has Dryopterus in its name, and that kind of hints at the fact that this plant can take a lot of dry. And in fact, you find this plant locally growing in wooded areas, so sugar bushes, beech bushes, so on, where there's very little moisture in the soil, quite shady, and then these things will be growing naturally in those areas. Some of the more common ferns that we buy at the nursery, they need a fair amount of moisture, so you have to situate these correctly. I also have some little ferns that are growing on top of a limestone rock. So this is a big rock. It's about 5 feet in diameter. It has some nice cracks. It has lots of moss on it, but it's extremely dry. I never water it, so all it gets is natural rain. The moss sucks that up pretty fast. Most of the rain runs off the rock. And in the middle of this thing are a number of ferns, so they can take very dry conditions. If you plant them in the right spot, ferns are very easy to take care of, and they're pretty much self-pruning. So in the spring, they're usually laying on the ground, and you can just leave the vegetation there and let it regrow. Hellebores have become really popular plants. I personally don't really care for them. I have a number of them in the garden, but they're not my favorite plants, and I don't know why they're becoming so popular. The big problem with these is that the heads usually face down, and so you can't see the flowers. You see the back of the bracts, but you don't actually see them well. But it has a lot of advantages to a garden. So the one is that it flowers really early. And this thing can be flowering when the snow's still on the ground, and the flowers will come through it. In zone 5, it's not quite hardy as far as the leaves go. So in the spring, you end up with leaves that look quite ratty. Some are green. If they were covered with more snow, they look a little better. If they're a little more exposed, the leaves are quite brown. Those are last year's leaves, and they're going to start dying off. So what a lot of people will do in the spring is just come and cut all those leaves off. But you have to do that very carefully, because in the spring you also have all the buds coming. So if you just come and shear the whole plant, you'll probably cut the flowers off. So I usually leave them until I can see the flower spikes coming up, and then I carefully trim the leaves off. After flowering, the plant will make a new set of leaves, and then you'll have a nice green set of leaves that come up. The other advantage, and one of the reasons people like this plant, is because it flowers a long time. So typically this will look as if it's in flower for 3 to even 4 months in the spring. And there aren't many plants that will do that. In fact, it's not flowering for 4 months. The flowers actually only last a couple weeks, and that's true of most perennials. What we have here is a set of bracts that stay on the plant a long time. So the thing you're looking at, the thing that looks pretty, the thing that looks like a flower, is actually not the flower. Those are the bracts around the flower. The flower itself is tiny and inside, and people hardly even notice it. But if you take one of these and have a real close look, the flowers inside are actually kind of interesting too. But they're gone pretty quick. And then we have this showy bract that lasts a long time. There are a number of these kind of plants for the garden, and if you pick plants with long-lasting bracts, then it appears as if these plants are flowering for a long time. The Persicaria that I showed you earlier, the giant fleece flower, that has the same kind of flowers. The flower comes out and only lasts a couple weeks, but the bracts around it last for 6 to 8 weeks, and so it looks as if it's flowering for a long time in the garden. Now, this is a new plant, and a lot of the information you hear about hellebores is that they're a little tricky to grow, they're a little tender, you got to take care of them, and so on. So this particular one is called green Corsican, and it became quite a large clump, and I decided, well, I'm going to cut it up and see how well it transplants. So I cut it into about 7 plants, and I took the little bits and put it into my sugar bush. So this is an area that's quite natural. There's just a few native plants growing there, a few trilliums and so on. But I put this plant in and I left it. I only watered them once when I planted, and then I left it, and I wanted to see what it would do. And you know what? All those plants are growing just fine. This is a really, really tough plant. Now, if you like hellebores, I much prefer this one. I have this one in a number of spots in the garden. It's great for dry shade and can take a fair amount of sun. It looks like this all year long. So these leaves are truly evergreen, even in zone 5 in the winter. The snow will cover this plant. When the snow recedes, you'll see these green leaves sitting there. Now the flowers are not quite as nice looking, and in some years the wet spring will kill the buds, but the plant itself is great looking. Now it is short-lived, so I find these plants will live for about 4 years and then they seem to disappear. but by then has made a number of babies all around itself. And the seeds somehow they actually travel a fair distance from the mother plant, and you'll have babies growing. So I've never lost this plant in 20 years. I always have more babies than I really want. The flower itself, it's a chartreuse color. Not the most spectacular flowers, so some years I even just cut the flowers off and just enjoy the foliage. But this plant looks great between other larger leaf plants like our hostas and light green colored leaves and so on. If you go to the nursery and you ask them for plants for dry shade, there's a very good chance that you'll be directed to the epimediums. And in Ontario, I've seen maybe 6 different cultivars that are available. They're all fairly similar. If you see them in catalogs, you'll see these really beautiful flowers, and they are very nice, kind of orchid looking. The problem is that they've zoomed way in to show you that flower, and so it looks fantastic on the page, when in fact it's quite a small flower. It's about the size of your thumbnail. They are pretty, they are colorful, but I wouldn't really plant it for the flowers. The reason you plant this is mostly for the leaves. So it has these nice large leaves, and some of them are quite red. It makes a nice ground cover, no weeds underneath it. Looks nice all year long. It does go underground in the winter time, but it's just a really nice looking plant that takes zero effort, zero care. We sell this as a plant that loves dry shade. In fact, where it really wants to grow is in a fairly sunny spot with lots of moisture. And if you grow it in that kind of a spot, you actually get huge plants, and they're much, much happier there. But it does grow well in dry shade. So I like to put this plant in places like close to tree trunks and so on, where I don't really want to do any maintenance, or higher up on a slope, and I just leave them alone. There are also trees that you can get for dry shade. Flowering dogwood is one of those. There are 2 basic types you can get. You can get the Florida dogwood, which is a North American native, or you can get the Kusa, which is an Asian variety. I know a lot of people want to grow native, but in this case, you're probably better off not growing native. The Florida dogwood has a disease called anthracnose, and it's destroying all of the native populations throughout North America. There's a very good chance that if you plant it somewhere, you'll get the disease too. Turns out Kusa is resistant to the disease and doesn't seem to get it. So in this case, you're better off planting a non-native plant. Now what we're looking at here are these nice white flowers, and they seem to stay on this tree forever. Well, again, this is a case where we're not looking at the flowers. Flowers are actually the tiny little green things in the center, and the white that we're looking at are the bracts, and that's why this plant seems to flower for a long period of time. An Ontario native plant that's quite nice is Viburnum trilobum. Flowers nice, makes a reasonably nice looking shrub, can be pruned into a tree shape or into a shrub shape, can be kept shorter or taller. This one's actually quite large and is a native plant that's been on the property for at least 30 years. It was there when I moved in. It's quite tall, so this one's about 12 feet tall. It's fairly nice flowers. Now there is a viburnum beetle that attacks certain viburnums. It turns out that trilobum is attacked some years, but it's mostly resistant. So some of the other viburnums are attacked more than this one, but in some years it does get the larva on it. Another favorite of mine is the redbud. And these can grow in fairly sunny areas, but can also grow in fairly shady areas. It's a good understory tree to put underneath larger trees like maples and beech and so on. Flowers are really nice in the spring, and one of the reasons it's so showy is that the leaves haven't come out yet. So the buds come out first, they open up, they give us the show, and then the leaves start. And that's why it looks so nice. Plant, though, has a very serious problem. It's the crotch that it forms between the branches. So you'll have a main stem coming up, you'll make a side branch, but it makes a very narrow crotch. That crotch then, as it gets older has a tendency to break off. So the branches tend to break off the main plant. So it does need a fair amount of maintenance. I mean, it's just a matter of coming along in the spring and cutting off the broken pieces. But you know, you might have a nice looking tree like this for a couple of years, and then in the wintertime, one of these big branches will just completely break off. So that is a downside. If that happens, then the tree does sucker a lot from the ground and you can regrow it, but it does take a little pruning to make that happen. This is another native. It's not quite as showy. It has little white flowers, but it's a hardy plant, can grow in quite deep shade. In fact, the first one of these I found on my property was growing under sugar maples, and it was completely crowded in by European buckthorn. I didn't even know I had this plant until I started clearing out the buckthorn and opening up the area. And then in the middle, I had one of these large trees, and it was producing seed that was actually popping up in different parts of the garden. So it does seed around a little bit, but not really to any extent. It's very hardy, very easy to grow. So let's get away from the dry area and look at what we're going to do in wet areas. Drainage is really important, and I never really appreciated it until I did this. So this is my garden in front of my house, and on the left side here is a large sunny perennial bed, and I'd even brought in soil to hill it up. I made these nice pathways. I put in crushed stone. It's all grown very nicely, and then we got a heavy rain. And it turns out that the rain from this whole driveway kind of goes down that one black archway. It's all directed there. The beds were directing it there because I'd raised them up a bit. The driveway leans a little bit that way. So it's really important to understand drainage in a new garden. So if you're doing any kind of garden design for someone, the best thing you can do is to go out there on a really heavy rainy day and watch where the water pools. So what happens? So I put in the nice pathway. First heavy rain, it washed all that gravel down the hill. So I thought, well, I didn't pack it hard enough, right? So I brought it back up, relayed it, packed it down really good and hard this time. Next heavy rain, washed it down the hill. There's so much water rushing down there on a heavy rain that the crushed rock just wouldn't hold itself. It got washed away. So I came up with this solution, which I haven't seen in a lot of places, but it works really well. This is kind of like a cattle gate. So there's some 2x4s in here. You can see the grass on the one side and the pathway on the other side. Down below there is a 4-inch PVC pipe that goes underneath the gravel. Now when it rains, all the water flows into this thing, goes down the pipe, and the pipe exits down the bottom of the hill. And since I put this in, I have no problems with heavy rain. This really worked very well. If you do have a lot of water, you want to try to collect it somewhere on the property. We have a tendency right now to build homes to keep all the water away from the homes, which makes a lot of sense. We don't want them in the basement. But we tend to direct all that water to the street. If it gets to the street, then we have to collect it. It gets cleaned and sent out down some river somewhere. But we have to go through that cleaning process. Then the homeowner comes along and says, well, my garden is too dry. So they get out the hose, and we use water that we've purified for drinking, and we use it to water our gardens. And this whole cycle just doesn't make any sense. We have to start trying to design these gardens so we keep the water off the street, we keep it on the property, and we collect as much of this water as we can. And a very good way of doing that is to use a rain garden. And rain gardens can be very simple. I've seen 50-page documents describing how to build a rain garden. They don't have to be so complicated. What it really is a depression in the ground where the excess water will go. Now, if we have a heavy rain, you have to figure out where the excess will go if you fill this area. You can put sand in the soil underneath to help the water run away, but you don't need to do that. The idea here is that we collect the water, we pool it for a day or two. After 2 days, the water should have run down, seeped into the soil. And then we plant the area with things that like to be a little wetter. And there's lots of plants that will grow well there. Because the water only sits there for a couple days, we don't have problems with mosquitoes and so on. This is a slide I found online somewhere, and it mentions what a lot of people repeat all the time. It says native plants attract butterflies and birds, and native plants do not require fertilizer and absorb runoff and pollutants. Well, that's true. Native plants do those, but non-native plants do all those things as well. I'm particularly troubled with the fact that they say native plants don't need fertilizer. Native plants are no different than non-native plants as far as their fertilizer and nutrient requirements go. They're not any different than non-native plants as far as runoff goes or pollutants either. So it's great to plant native. I'm a big fan of that, and we should get homeowners more conditioned to accepting and using native plants, but we have to be careful that the message we bring across is actually correct. If you take the wrong native plant and put it in the wrong spot, it won't do well. We still have to site those plants correctly. All right, so which plants like more moisture? Well, here's one that almost demands it. This is a Japanese forest grass. It comes in a couple different colors, so there's a solid green one, there's some with some pinkish stripes in it. Particularly like this variegated one. And if you take this plant and you put it in the right spot, it grows really nicely. It's not a fast growing plant, but it eventually fills in really nicely. You put this in a spot that's a little too dry, it gets smaller every year. This plant can take part shade to shade. It really needs extra moisture. This is an interesting plant. So Trollius is a globe flower. Now, globe flowers come from high altitude mountain regions where they grow in wet bogs. So we take this plant and we bring it into our garden, and it grows just about everywhere. It will grow in part shade, it will grow in full sun, it grows wet, it grows dry. Seems like no matter where I put this plant, it does well. And it comes in a variety of different flavors. So this is a really nice orange one. Comes in yellows, comes 3-4 feet tall, and the smallest ones I have are about 6 inches tall, and they flower very early in the year. So there's a number of different species, a number of different cultivars, and you can pick the plant that fits your location. These guys really do enjoy moisture. The other plant that's great for a wet area is a Siberian iris. So this is my collection. The area it's growing in looks like a regular garden bed, but this is actually a bog. I seen this idea of creating a bog garden. I thought, I'm going to give this a try. So this is in the middle of my property, full sun all day. There's no shade whatsoever. Dug out a hole that was about 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep. I lined it with cheap plastic. You don't need a pond liner for this. You poke some holes in the bottom. You fill it back with soil. A lot of people will use a very peaty soil, but I just put my garden soil back, which is a fairly heavy clay soil, and I planted and I mulched it. And I expected that this thing would dry out faster, but it turns out that this garden is moist all year long. I never have to water this. The gardens around it that are in the same situation but don't have the plastic, they tend to dry out. Now in those gardens I put drought tolerant plants, and in this bog garden I put plants that like it moist. But I never have to water this all summer. The soil underneath here stays wet. I like Siberian iris. The plant looks nice all year. It doesn't get the iris borer. You might want to deadhead this one. It looks a little nicer. In the fall, the leaves go nice and red, so you get a nice fall coloration. I think this is a great plant. And I grow this in wet locations and dry locations. It doesn't need the moisture, but it does do well in moisture. Comes in a lot of different colors. These are some of my favorites. Butter sugar is a smaller one. It only grows to about 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. A nice whitish color flower. White swirl is taller and whiter. And this one's interesting. This one is not in that bog garden. This one is actually in that front garden beside the driveway that gets full sun all summer long. Now, if you look at the position of this plant, it's right beside a juniper. And junipers are known for having a very fibrous root system where they suck up all the water. So it's actually hard to grow things around junipers. So I had planted this iris beside the juniper, and it never really did very well. I mean, it grew okay, had a few flowers every year, but wasn't that happy. So then I dug it up and I moved it about 3 feet to the left. So it was a little farther from the juniper. So now it got more sun. It didn't have nearly as much root competition. And the first year I had over 20 flowers on this. It shows you how fussy sometimes plants are. Not that this is a difficult plant to grow, but being really close to a juniper just dries the soil out like crazy. So it's a really tough place for a thing to grow. Moving it a few feet made all the difference. If you have a really wet area, you can also grow the Japanese iris. This flowers later than the Siberian. The flowers are larger, they're a little more colorful, but this plant really does need moisture. It doesn't do well in a dry spot. If you have a really wet area, you can also grow this one, the Louisiana iris. This flower is as large as the palm of my hand. Beautiful plant. The Ligularias is a great plant for a shady area and a wet area. This is kind of an odd plant. It seems to grow well in a lot of spots. You can even grow it in a fair amount of sun, but in summer, in the middle of the day, all the leaves just hang down. They're drooping. And so people come along and they water it. Well, that doesn't do anything. The problem with this plant is the leaf system is larger than the root system. And the leaves are so big and they release so much water that the roots can't keep up with the plant. So the leaves droop in the middle of the day. By later in the day, by evening, the leaves are back up and turgid, and the plant is fine. It just does this every time in the middle of summer whenever it's hot, and there's not much you can do about it. I've tried growing this in basically water, and it still did it. It just seems to be part of the nature of the plant. I prefer this Ligularia. It's called the Rocket. It makes these nice upright spikes, and the leaves are a little more interesting. If you don't like a tall plant, because the top of these flowers is probably about 5 feet, there's a smaller version of the Rocket available. Another plant that I really like is the Regersias. Now these plants do well in wet areas and they don't like to be too dry. This one is growing on the north side of a house, so it doesn't lose a lot of moisture, but it also never gets irrigated and does all right there. Has nice flowers. Flowers last a long time. It's a great looking plant. These leaves, they're compound leaves, and they're a good 18 inches across. This is one of my all-time favorites, and everyone that comes to the garden says, "Oh, I want this plant." And then I have to warn them that you probably don't want this plant. It makes huge leaves. The flowers really early in the spring. It's one of the first flowers that you'll see, along with the snowdrops. Most people don't even know about that because the flower is not that spectacular. That's when it flowers. Then it makes these huge leaves. It's really nice in the garden. The problem is it runs like crazy. It will run in 2 or 3 feet in every direction every year, covers large areas, seems to love moisture but will also grow drier, love shade but it will also grow in parched sun. Problem is it's so invasive and spreads so fast that it doesn't work in most gardens. So there are a couple tricks you can do. You can put it in an area where it's surrounded by concrete. So I had someone come to me and ask me for some cuttings, and I warned him. I said, "You probably don't want this." He says, "Well, I'm putting it beside my pool, and I have concrete on one side and concrete on the other side." And so he had this bed that was surrounded by concrete, so it couldn't go anywhere. And I said, "Okay, I'll be perfect." Now, the way I grow it is I actually put it in a large pot. So it's a big tree pot that I've cut the bottom out and sunk it in the ground. So the edge of the plastic from the pot is 2 or 3 inches above the soil line, and that prevents the runners from getting out of the pot. So they still grow, but they grow around and around in a circle, and they stay in the pot. And I've tried that with a number of aggressive plants, and most of them don't really like that very much. They don't do well. This one is fine, and then about every 5 or 6 years, I completely dig it up, throw 90% away, and start a few roots, and away it goes again. But it is a spectacular plant. Another plant that I really like, it's kind of common, but it's beautiful, is the blue Arctic willow. And you can grow this as a low-growing shrub. I tend to cut it back to the ground every year so it doesn't grow too tall. It loves wet areas. Great addition. The Cornus Arctic fire is, of course, nice in the winter time. This is a plant that does take a little more work because to keep these branches nice and red, you do have to prune it on a regular basis and cut most of the old wood out. So you're always looking at new wood. All right, let's look at a couple of specific dry pears. So growing under walnut trees. You probably heard that you can't grow anything under walnut trees. There's a chemical called juglone. It turns out that most of this is a myth. The walnut tree actually doesn't even have juglone in it, although one of the compounds that it releases does turn into juglone. But most things grow under a walnut tree. And here's a list of just some of them. The Ontario government has a list of all the things that grow under walnut trees, and it's pretty much everything in the garden. The problem with walnut trees is it's a shady, dry area. That keeps things from growing. But the juglone is really not as big a problem as people make out. Another problem I see mentioned a lot is growing under evergreen trees. And people are concerned that the needles from the evergreen tree are too acidic. They make the soil acidic. That actually doesn't happen. First of all, the needles are not acidic. When they're green, they're slightly acidic, but by the time they fall off, they're no longer acidic, and they won't have any effect on the pH of soil. The problem with evergreens is that you're dealing with dry shade. The evergreens stay there all year long, so even in the spring and fall, it's covered with leaves, so you have year-long shade. Very dry root system. What about slopes? The big thing with slopes is that you want to modify them so that you don't get pooling of water. When you have a big slope, water runs down and runs into other areas and causes problems. So ideally you change that slope a bit. The slope in my backyard, I put some pathways in it and I put some raised areas in it so that I've changed the whole slope of the backyard. And then it's easier to plant in. Here's some suggestions for slopes. Disturb the soil as little as possible. Once you disturb that soil, you're just going to have more soil running down the hill if it rains. Try to plant with smaller plants or seedlings. You want lots of little plants on the area rather than a few large plants. Again, use low maintenance because it's just too difficult to work on a slope. You don't want to be up there pruning things. You don't want to be up there weeding things. So pay particular attention to the maintenance of these plants. I like the idea of killing the vegetation so that you don't have the weeds and then starting fresh and planting something. I don't amend planting holes anyways, plant things, but particularly on a hill because you don't want to create large holes of amended soil. And in the first few years, they do need irrigation and drip systems would work well there. The way you plant on a slope is you actually create a flat area to plant on. So you take a bit of the soil and move it down the hill to raise it up so you have a bit of a berm there. And then you plant in that soil. The reason for doing this is that once it's flat like this, it's better able to collect the water. And so you have to irrigate this less. If you try to plant on a slope, then anytime you try to water, the water just runs right away. It doesn't run into the rooted area. I always make these kind of flat areas, even if I'm on a steep slope. A lot of people suggest to plant grasses to stabilize the slope. And I think that's a good idea if you're planting ornamental grasses. I don't think lawn grasses are very suitable for this. They're hard to get established. Once they're established, the lawn basically just sends all the water down the hill and causes a problem somewhere else. But ornamental grasses would be suitable. Here are some other plants that I like for slopes. Again, they meet the criteria being very low maintenance and drought tolerance. Mat forming junipers are great. Basically, you plant them once and get them. I really like this plant called Stephanandra. It's a shrubby plant that over the years gets slightly taller and taller. It starts out as a ground cover, so it's 6 inches tall, but the next year it's like 7 inches tall, then 8 inches tall. It kind of grows over top of itself and then hangs down. And because of this drooping growth, it looks really nice on a slope. It's thick enough that you'll never have weeds there. The leaves are small, so they fall off and just go to the ground. You don't have to rake leaves. You don't have to clean it up. You might come along here every 10 years or so and just cut it back because it's getting a bit tall. And that's it. If you have a slope like this, literally an hour every 10 years to do some pruning here and you're done. It also flowers very nicely. This is another one of my favorite plants is a geranium macrorrhizum. And I like to put this at the edge of gardens, kind of between the formal gardens and the wooded areas. I like to put it on slopes where I never want to do anything. So this particular picture is taken on a very steep slope, and there's no way I want to go up there to weed anything or to cane it at all. It grows in sunny areas, shady areas. Once it's established, it makes a nice ground cover, flowers for a couple of weeks of the year. The rest of the year, it's just covered and looks really nice, and you just kind of ignore the whole thing. I think this is a great plant. And I use this in other areas that are not sloped. For instance, this is a great plant around the base of a tree. So we got an area there that's very dry, very shady. put this there. Once it's established, you just ignore it. Mow the lawn that goes around it and just leave it. If you want to get in touch with me, I have a YouTube channel and a Facebook group and a podcast. They're all called Garden Fundamentals. You're welcome to join our Facebook group and ask questions there. Our YouTube channel has over 400 gardening videos, all kinds of topics. I also have a blog called gardenmyths.com, which is really my passion, where I try to debunk a lot of the misinformation that's floating around. I have a couple books called Garden Myths Book 1 and Book 2. Each one has about 120 myths in it. Each one is completely different. These are available on Amazon. And I have a number of other books that I've published: Soil Science for Gardeners, Microbe Science, Compost Science, Food Science, and Plant Science, and Building Natural Ponds, which was really one of my first books. It looks at how do you build a pond without any equipment, no electricity, no pumps, no filters, no chemicals. Let's just build a natural pond. People told me that you couldn't do this 20 some years ago, so I built one. It worked really well. I have a pond that I do nothing to it. The plants themselves clean the water. There's all kinds of insects and animals come to drink. Completely natural. It works really well. If you want any of these books, you can get them from my publisher. If you go to gardenmyths.com, Pavlis25, that will take you directly to the publisher. And if you use the discount code Pavlis25, you'll get 25% discount off any of those.